The world around us is filled with the beauty of art. It plays an important role in every aspect of life. Let's go now and talk to a very special artist and learn a little bit about the forms of art that she does. Let's join Mrs. Martha Ensign-Johnson.
Calligraphs are basically printed collages. This one I'm doing more cutting away. Whatever lines I put in with the X-Acto knife will print when I put it through my printing press. You can see that it's got different depths and different textures. The more texture will print darker, and the smoother will print lighter, so I can get my image.
It's really neat. How long have you been doing this?
Well, when I first took printmaking, that was my sophomore year in college. The person that I took printmaking from did calligraph printmaking. She also did etching. I was more interested in etching because etching is with metal and you do a lot of linear stuff, and I loved drawing and line at that time. So I was really more interested in that. But later, after when I had my first child, I didn't want my child around nitric acid fumes or nitric acid, and that's what you need to use when you do etchings. So I had my printing press and I wanted to do printmaking, so I decided I would just do calligraph printmaking. So that was in 1978. So since then I've been working primarily in calligraphs.
How'd you learn how to do that?
The first course that I took, this lady did calligraphs, and so it's really, there are books on it, but it's basically a printed collage, so you have to learn what works and what doesn't work, kind of by trial and error. It's not like a science. It's more what works and what doesn't work. You have to remember that certain things shouldn't get put through the press. Like if you put something really big through your press, it will ruin your press. It doesn't take a real lot of depth or height to print, but just a difference in the feel and the texture will print. There's all sorts of them here I've been playing around with. Right now I'm playing around with flicking gesso, so you get this real mottled surface. I don't know what that's going to be print like. I think it'd be interesting.
What is flicking gesso?
Oh, well see, basically I'm working with a variety of polymers. Gesso is this thicker, harder white stuff, and commonly this is used to cover canvases for an artist if they're going to do paintings. But it will make enough of a build-up on the surface of a piece of cardboard to print. And down here I've just put lines in. If I wanted to, I could do just straight line work, like this one right here, where I let the gesso sort of harden, and then I can go in with a stylus, just like I was etching, and draw lines in it, and that will print.
And then you run this through your print.
Through the press.
How long have you been an artist?
Well, I don't know how long I've been an artist. I decided I was going to be an artist when I was 4. And really fought with my teachers through school that I was going to be an artist. I wasn't going to be a mathematician or whatever else they had in mind. And so when I went to college, I knew that's what I was going to major in, and focused right on in art. And I've never stopped since. As soon as I got out of school, I became a waitress so I could earn enough money to buy my press, and after that, I quit work and have devoted all my time to artwork.
Now, do you make all your own paper to do this then?
No, that paper making thing started because when I get the calligraph plates constructed, I print them on a pH neutral paper imported from Europe. Most of my papers come from France. But the paper comes a certain size. So my print doesn't need to use an entire piece of paper, so I would be cutting off edges. And I had all of this scrap paper, and we're talking expensive, nice paper. So what I have done since 1983 is I take all those scraps of paper, and first of all I learned to recycle them. And then as I learned that that recycled paper is sculptable, you can make it into three-dimensional forms, I've gradually begun adding things into it. One of the papers I make is cotton fibers I will add into it. That makes a stronger, more pulpy paper, thicker, a little bit sturdier when I sculpt it. Even stronger than that is if I add wool fibers in, and that will really sculpt almost like you were using clay. And then I've also begun making mulberry paper, because mulberry is a very long fiber and it can be made into very thin paper. So if I want, especially in my sculptures, if I want something thin and flowing, then I will use the mulberry paper.
How do you make the paper?
Well, I take those scraps and I tear them up into little teeny pieces of paper the size of my thumbnail. And then I use a blender, which is not, it works for me. If you were going to be a paper maker, you would not want to use a blender. A blender does cut fibers, but by tearing it into the thumb-sized pieces of paper, I'm pulling the fibers apart. And then I put it in the blender with hot water. I let it soak a little while before I put it through the blender, and then I end up with this mess that is actually liquid paper. From there I go and spread it out on plastic, and I sponge out all the excess moisture, and then I can print that on my printing press with my collograph plates. When you construct a collograph plate, I always start with mat board. I do that primarily because there again I have a lot of scraps, but also because it's basically the same depth. And if I use the same depth of a board, I don't have to monkey with the pressure on the press. So I always use scrap mat board. There are a variety of things you can do to mat board that make it a printable surface. Incising lines, like I was doing when you came in, with a razor blade will make a very linear print. If I incise a line, say, we'll just do this, then I can peel off the top layer of a mat board, and you'll get a different surface to print. This will print differently. In fact, this will give you a dark and a light, so if you were just going to do mountainsides or something like that, peeling this off, and here I have a very uncooperative piece of mat board, of course, but this surface will print differently than this surface. So that's one thing you can do. You can also cut out shapes, and I do a lot of cutting out of fine details. There's one here where the tree leaves are actually pencil shavings from when you sharpen pencils. I've glued those down first, and then I've cut very finely detailed tree trunks and tree branches and glued that on top. That's another option to collage your surface like that. Then there's all sorts of things that you can do with a variety of polymers. I use basically 4 different things. I use the acrylic matte medium, acrylic gesso, acrylic gloss medium and varnish, and then this stuff up here, which is actually modeling paste that's an acrylic base. All of these things will print differently. Gesso is commonly used to coat canvases before you paint. But if I coat a plate with that, I can actually draw lines in it that will print differently than a cut line. So I do a lot with the gesso. This stuff, this modeling paste, is a harder stuff than the gesso, and you can build up quite a surface with that. A fun thing to do with this is to take a palette knife and spread a thin layer, and it makes wonderful skies or surfaces with textures that are just really neat with this stuff. The others are my glues, basically. If I use matte medium, I primarily use that for gluing stuff. These watered down will give me 2 different printing surfaces. Say we went back to that one that I was doing when you came in. This I had just been cutting at. If I were to coat this with a thin down matte medium, I would get my strongest darks, but I wouldn't get my strongest, most brilliant whites. To get my most brilliant whites, I will use the gloss medium because it seals the finest, and it's almost a varnished surface.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, we collage, we get textures from collages, but also our sealants make different color hues also to throw in color. One major difference between colograph printmaking and etching is that in etching you are limited to a certain spectrum of colors. For some reason zinc reacts with your yellows and your reds and will turn the color, browns it. So that with collagraphs, all of a sudden you have freedom to use any color you want. Also, it's cheaper, so that in etching, when you want to make more colors, you generally use different plates. Say, I wanted to make an etching that was 3-colored, and I have one. Each of the colors in an etching like this is a separate plate, so that the first plate would be maybe yellow, the second one lavender, and the third one brown. In collagraphs, you can do the same thing with different plates. I could cut 3 different plates for 3 different colors, or I could ink this 3 different days in 3 different colors. And I get a much more brilliant thing. It's just your choice. I can make 3 plates for my 3 colors, or I can use this over and over. I do a lot of careful note-taking when I print, because a lot of mine are more complex. Say we're doing a landscape and one field has an undertone of gold, and maybe the second day that I print, first day I'll put gold, the second day I might put an orange tone, and the third day I might put a brown tone, and that field will have a glow of yellow underneath a brown field, very autumn color. Another section I might want an undertone of lavender. So if I take careful notes, and I have notebooks full of my notes on how I printed a print, I can do a lot of undertoning of color, and it makes a glowing print. This is a good example of what happens when you print over a series of days. This field here has a gold undertone. The second day it has a light green, and the third day was printed in brown. And you can see the difference in that. In this field that had gold, orange, and brown, you can really get a glow. There's a strong difference in these areas that were printed 3 days and the area that was printed just 1 day, which is why I've done this as a puzzle plate. Each of these is a separate piece of cardboard that fits together on the press. This one is kind of interesting too. I use this often when I teach because it's got coffee grounds for the background mountains. This is actually pulled apart cotton that was embedded in the glue. These were very meticulously cut out and glued, pieces of cardboard, needlepoint canvas, and sewing threads. It gives you a good idea.
So you use a lot of, just everyday materials in your artwork.
Now Martha will show us how to ink a collagraph plate.
I use a brush to ink my plates. It's a Japanese technique. I find that on a collagraph print, it does get the ink into some of the finer areas. So that's what I'm going to use to ink the plate. I go through a lot of brushes doing this too. One thing about collagraphs is that I can use etching inks to print with, but I can also use oil paints and lithography inks, a variety of oil-based paints and inks. And that gives me some freedom. There's a thing called viscosity printing, where the thicker your ink is, the darker the color will be. And so what I'm inking with now is etching ink, but I will also use on this print oil paints. I also can thin my inks with Crisco if I'm fairly careful with it. You wouldn't want to use a lot of Crisco or you'll get some bleed through of the oils. But that does give you a little bit more freedom to get more transparent colors than in some forms of printmaking.
Now, does it matter how you brush that on there? Does that affect the outcome at all?
Not at this point. Not at this point. This is really just getting the ink on, just so long as I do get it in all the recessed areas, because this is when it has to get in there. Another thing about collagraphs is this, what we're doing right now, is intaglio printing, where we are forcing the ink down into the recessed areas. I can also, with a collagraph, print relief. If you've done linoleum block printing, a lot of kids do that. It's surface printing, and you roll the ink on. And I could do that with this plate. I could just roll the ink on and get an entirely different print. And in some of my prints, I do both. I will intaglio, and then I will also roll inks on.
Why would you do both?
Just because I may want the recessed areas a color, but I also want the surface areas a color, and I can get a separate color on the raised surfaces. So the possibilities are really endless. The only thing is that if you're going to run an edition, which most forms of printmaking do, every single print has to be identical. So once I figure out that with this plate, this is what I want it to look like, I have to do that same process, however it was I got it to that point, I have to do it over and over, however many times. If my edition is 25, I have got to do the very same steps, first day orange, second day yellow, third day whatever, every single time.
So it involves a lot of careful note-taking.
That is the tedious part. This stuff is tarlatan, and it's starched cheeseclothy stuff. And that's what you use to force the inks down into your plate. You can probably cut this, it will take a while. Okay, we've tarlatan, we're going to go on. The art students will know this. This is the white. And they say, and I guess I have observed it, that every printmaker has a different wipe. This is also why my apron looks this way. But with my hand, I am wiping the inks, and you're seeing the texture come up on this plate.
Now, does the oil in your hand have anything to do with that?
I really don't think so. I think it's just how big this part of your hand is, and I think mine's probably not very big. But you know, some guys can just come along here with their big heavy paws, but their wipe will be different. And so oftentimes, like in studios that print prints for other people, the same person will wipe an edition, or they'll try to, because it will give a different look to the print. Now I'm going to look at my notes a second here. I tarlatan wiped this. That was the stiff stuff. I've hand wiped it. Now, I have written myself a note that on this one, I also paper wiped part of it. And by paper wipe, I just used newsprint torn up. And I am only going to wipe the floral part. Because if I wiped the background, I would lose my strong black.
So by wiping it, you settle it down?
I'm going to get clearer whites. It will make, I'm actually taking more of the ink off. And I want to do that for two reasons. One is, on this one, I want a stronger white on that part, but also I'm going to go back in and brush on some color.
After Martha colored the plates, we moved over to the press, and she showed us how to print.
There's an order to these felts. These are blankets. My dirtiest ones, the ones that take the hardest work, are the lower ones. And then there's the middle, more cushion one, and then there's the top one that will catch on the press.
Now, how many felts do you have to use for one?
Well, you just have to have those three types. and it just depends on the pressure you've got on. I've got mine set for this. Now I would take this and compare it. I think, I compare it to the one that was my original proof, which is named my artist proof. And if it's very close, then it will go as part of the edition.
Now why don't you hold that up there so the camera can see what this came out from. Now we have learned how to make paper, construct a plate, and print. Let's take a look at some of Martha's other works.